Please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good evening, everyone. This is the regularly scheduled meeting of the Board of Estimate and Taxation for May 2010. Item 2 comes before us. Request for budget adjustments, non-routine applications first. Let me provide this over to, does the Law Committee wish to present? The first item, my understanding is after a conversation with the town attorney, has been withdrawn, SE 11. That will come back to us in a subsequent meeting.
That's correct.
Okay. So before us now is SE 12. Mr. Mason, our chairman of our Budget Committee.
Office of the First Selectman, SE 12 for $442,000. And this is an additional appropriation for the storm cleanup, and I so move the item on behalf of the Budget Committee.
It's been moved by Mr. Mason. Second by Mr. Simon. Discussion. Mr. Mason?
This is part 2 for our storms that we had back in March, and there's some follow-up items on here. And the Budget Committee met and discussed these and approved these 4-0. We made a slight modification. You'll know one of the items has been reduced from our communications with Department of Public Works. And you'll notice on the blue sheet, fund source to be determined, because obviously some of these, as the town continues to have the meetings with FEMA, whether they're reimbursable or not, we're not sure. Our goal, I believe, as far as Budget Committee and then the BET as a whole, is we have Public Works, Police Department, Parks and Rec. We have an obligation to make sure that they have resources available to cover these expenses without going over their appropriations for the year. So our vote was 4-0 in favor of that item.
Further discussion. Ms. Barton.
Do you have a breakdown as to which accounts you'll be taking this money from?
Good.
At this point, I think we've left it to the controller to come back, and if you'll notice in your package, you have all the fund balances for the risk fund, capital non-recurring, general fund, and we did a couple exercises there. I think the question is that when some of these items get discounted as for FEMA reimbursement, they'll, for instance, let's use the generator as an example at Fleet. If that comes back as a non-qualifying event, we'll take that from capital non-recurring. But we won't know that until we get to the point with FEMA. What I would say is, depending on when this, because this is an RTM item, I would say we'll need to know that. I'm just talking to Mr. Minarski, that we'll need to know that by that time. But as of right now, until we get through the paperwork with FEMA, I would say that right now our idea would be just to increase the appropriation level.
We have to have a source. We just can't. I think you need to designate a fund. I think you have to say, you have to have a source. You just can't appropriate money from nothing. So we proposed, 345 from the capital non-recurring for those 4 items, and 97 from the risk fund for the non-4 items. The 4 items from the capital non-recurring were the generator, the guardrails, the seawall, and the jetty.
And I would concur with Mr. Simon on that. I think that the capital items should be directed to the capital non-recurring account. And obviously, if they can be reimbursed by FEMA funds, that's to everyone's advantage.
So I would propose amending that. To be
Well, let's see,
shown as
because it's not crystal clear, at least on the blue sheet. I just want to make sure everybody understands what we're voting on and the twos and the froms. So why don't we take it up as an amendment? I think it'll be cleaner for purposes of taking the minutes, because my understanding is the vote from the Budget Committee or the recommendation from the Budget Committee isn't crystal clear on this point. So, Mr. Simon, do you want to give those 4 items again? Make sure that the Secretary has them, and that way we can make sure that
the Budget Committee identified 4 items: the Fleet generator for $150,000, the guardrail repair at 11 locations for $42,000, the Byram jetty for $125,000, and the Greenwich Point seawall for $28,000. The 4 items total $345,000. these items, in my opinion, would have come from capital had they been requested in the normal course of the budget process. So I would recommend that $345,000 come from the capital non-recurring, and $97,000 being the balance comes from the risk fund. But I'm looking at these numbers and they don't add up right. They're off. There's not enough money here. These numbers that don't add to 442. Now, I have 20 and I have 25, which is 45 and 18 is 63 and 1 is 64.
33 for the police overtime.
Where's that?
Middle.
97, all right. Thank you, sorry. That's my motion.
Okay, so it's clear. It's been moved by Mr. Simon. Wait for a second to, out of the 442, break that down to 345,000 coming from the capital non-recurring, and the remainder at 97,000 coming from the risk fund. Is there a second?
I would second that.
Second by Ms. Tarkington. Discussion on the motion. Mr. Campbell.
Yeah, I just had one question. If those are the right numbers, and maybe this is directed, Roland or Peter, to you, on page 2 of your 2 pages to us on fund balance estimates, you identify in the risk fund May storm damage as being 122. Would it be 97?
The fund balance schedules were done at the old value of 467.
Got it. So we could take that down to 97, and we would reduce by $25,000 the diminution of that fund, right?
And you could reduce the number above it, too.
Mr. Mason.
Just a real quick note on this motion. If FEMA does reimburse any of the expenses coming out of capital non-recurring, we'll need a separate action to reimburse capital non-recurring for that purpose. Am I correct?
These are all being applied to FEMA for reimbursement. The $97,000 at the 75% rate will go back to the P fund, the risk fund. The capital non-recurring will go back, prorated, the amount will go back to the capital non-recurring fund.
But it'll take an action on our part to put it back in capital non-recurring.
We usually do that in June. I don't know if you want to wait a full year. We could take it out of sequence, definitely. Plus, anything that's returned, the funds will go back also. But we always do that in June, and we're not going to be able to do it, have the information for this June. So either we take it out of sequence, or we wait till next June.
But if we don't do anything, it will go back to the general fund.
No. If it comes out of capital non-recurring, it has to go back to capital non-recurring.
Ms. Tarkington.
Also, I would suggest, since these 4 items that Mr. Simon has mentioned are capital items, that since if they were in the normal process, we'd have one of those CIP sheets, at least it should be prepared for each of the items, so there is some record of these items as capital items. It's documentation. Obviously, we're taking it out of sequence, so they don't need to be ranked, but at least so that we have the documentation as such.
Well, these are repairs of,
This would be for the generator, the $150,000 for the generator, the guardrails, the jetty, the Byram jetty, and the Greenwich Point seawall, all which would be capital items, just so that we have them as a record.
I think we can figure out what information Ms. Tarkington is looking for and then provide that. All right, any other discussion on the motion? Okay, all those in favor on the Simon Tarkington motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? 12-0-0. Right, okay. Now, on the actual application as modified by the amendment, so the dollar amount stays at 442, coming out of the 2 funds. Discussion. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 12-0-0. TC1 now comes before us. Mr. Campbell, Chair of our HR Committee.
This motion is for a transfer from fixed charges of $31,200 and temporary salaries for 2 part-time employees in the town clerk's office, and I so move the item.
Moved by Mr. Campbell, second by Ms. Barton. Discussion. Mr. Campbell?
Thank you. At the HR committee meeting last week on May 11th, the committee took up this proposal again to approve the hiring of 2 part-time employees in the town clerk's office at 15 hours a week. Let me point out our blue sheet inadvertently refers to the employees at 30 hours a week each, but it's 15 hours a week. Now, I think as all of you know, this is the first proposal to come before the BET to transfer funds from fixed charges to fill a position that has been on the list of vacant positions. The Finance Committee, of course, of the RTM, most recently had proposed a resolution to remove the funding for these positions from the budget. While the RTM rejected that resolution, I think that the sentiment was widely shared that any filling of these positions should certainly be closely examined. As regards this particular appropriation, the town clerk's office has seen 2 reductions in staffing in the past 2 years. 1 full-time employee was laid off in 2009, and another full-time employee retired in 2009, and that position was not filled. Funding for the vacant position is included in the 2010-11 budget in fixed charges at a salary of $48,110, not including benefits. And as per a resolution of this body from our March meeting, BET approval is required to fill the position. The town clerk explained to the HR committee that the 25% reduction in staffing in her office has left the office understaffed and in particular under extreme pressure at times to maintain counter hours at both the upstairs main counter and the downstairs vital statistics counter. The request again is for 2 part-time positions at a total annual cost of $31,200, and it is in lieu of filling the vacant position. The committee voted 4-0 to approve the request.
Further discussion. We have here our town clerk, Harm Butkins. Mr. Huffman.
I just I found this a reasonable and sensible approach to a staffing problem, and something that we'd like to see.
Further discussion.
It
Mr. Simon.
just should be noted that this is next year, fiscal year 2011.
It's effective July 1st of 2010. That's right. Further discussion. It should also be noted this is a transfer, and so will not require RTM approval. So starting just July 1st, that money will be in that account. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention? 12-0-0. Okay, thank you. That is the end of the non-routine applications. I call now on the clerk for the routine applications. Mr. Pellegrino.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move CD4. This is the Community Development Department. There's a request for an additional appropriation of $26,921 for repairs at the Family Center.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino. Second by Mr. Mason.
Are you gonna do all of them?
All of them. We'll do all of them.
Okay. The next routine application is SE13. This is the Office of the First Selectman. This is a request for $40,964. It's an additional appropriation recommended by Coastal Resources.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino. Second by Mr. Mason.
And finally, SE10, also from the First Selectman's Office. This is an additional appropriation for $30,000 for the settlement of a suit that is Gordon versus Maloney.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino. Second by Ms. Barton. Discussion on any of these items? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 12-0-0. Item 3 now comes before us. Our town assessor, Ted Courtney. Bob Shipman is here with us as well. Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. You have my report, and just in summary, we have completed the senior tax credit program. We have 809 senior citizens that have applied for the credits this year, and I've given you email this afternoon about the total cost of the program. You also have the talk that I gave at the Round Hill Association and my other notes, and I'd be anxious or be willing to answer any questions that you might have.
Questions for the assessor? Mr. Kelly?
Just a point, I didn't get your email, Mr. Gortney. Mr. Gortney, over here.
I'm sorry.
I didn't get your email, so if you could correct my email address, get the correct address, I'd appreciate it.
On the BET one as well.
Is there still an issue with that? Obviously through the assessor's office, but is that the only place you're having problems with it?
I get them from you.
Yeah, but you may not get the general BET emails.
Yeah, so we can, that's pretty critical. Okay. All right, so we'll see why that happened. Maybe we can go back and actually look at the email that Ted did send out to see if there are two lists or what's happening with that.
Quick question for clarification. You did get the BET from the finance department, correct, today? Ted, congratulating Ted? I thought you just said you got a Round Hill one.
That was it.
That was it.
But there were two that were sent out.
But the second one, you didn't get the one from the assessor's office, correct? Right.
Right. This has been an ongoing problem, so we should probably try to take care of this. Okay. Further questions for the assessor? Just so that everybody knows, and maybe for those who are watching on Channel 79, one of the key roles of the assessor in an evaluation year or a revaluation year is to ensure that the public knows about what it is that you do and to help educate the public. So to the extent that there are any associations that ask for the assessor to come and speak before their particular neighborhood association, the assessor is available to do that. I've already received comments that suggest that you went to the Round Hill Association for some other reason, and I think it's important to note that if another association asks you to come to speak on the reval, that you certainly would do so and give a similar presentation. So hopefully some of the associations who are concerned about the reval and want to know more about it will get in touch with your office, and it'll be a more of a general occurrence, so that the more people that are educated on this, I think the better off we all are as a town.
I gave 15 or 20 presentations 5 years ago, and I'd welcome the opportunity to repeat all of those and any additional.
Further questions? Yes.
Stephen, I think that's a great suggestion. I think we'd almost be better off proactive if he sent a notice that he does have this information, this PowerPoint, to like Riverside and Old Greenwich and the various organizations, so they don't have to think about, can they ask for this? He ought to say, I'm available to do this, and you could schedule me. I'd rather be proactive and get the information out there.
Sure. Does the First Selectman's Office still maintain that database of neighborhood association presidents? So why don't we do that? I think it's a good suggestion. Why don't you coordinate with the First Selectman's Office, get a hold of that list?
It's actually on the email, if you type in # I think
Through their email server?
Okay.
And push that out so that you can give a presentation.
We'll do
Mr.
that.
Kelly will join you when you get inundated with the 20.
I'll go to any one you want, and we'll keep it reasonably short.
Okay.
Further questions?
I'm
for the
on
assessor?
TV, right, so I'm bound by that? Yeah. Okay.
We'll hold you to it.
Yeah.
I move we accept the assessor's report.
Motion made to accept the assessor's report.
Second.
Second by Mr. Finger. Discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention, 12-0-0. Thank you. Before the assessor leaves, there sometimes are questions regarding the senior tax relief in the context of, I know last year we had a discussion relative to the mill rate, but because you are here now, why don't we just take up that particular item? We'll consider it under the umbrella of the assessor's report. Other than Mr. Kelly, you should have received the updated vantage point of the senior tax relief and the numbers and how that program worked this year. I note, Ted, that that there were no applications for the tax deferral program, correct? That's correct. Okay. And the estimate versus the budget is a difference of $150,000, essentially to the positive from a budget perspective. Okay. Are there any other questions for our assessor regarding this form?
I do.
Mr. Simon?
So are the applications, this includes all the applications are closed, they can't come in the mail?
That's correct. There are still maybe some adjustments back and forth, but this is what we expect right now.
So if we appropriate the 904, we have to actually appropriate a specific number. This is going to make sure that we're not going to inadvertently cut somebody off. I mean, we could appropriate 910, and it would have no practical effect on anything.
We've made this estimate every year, and we've been within, a few $100 of being exact.
And then at some point at the end of this period, you're going to give a distribution by income of the tax credits? That would be very helpful to see. Thank you.
Other questions? Mr. Huffman?
Yes. Does the information you receive with the application include information as to whether the homeowner has a mortgage on that property?
No, it does not. The only time that that's important is if they're on the deferral program.
Well, I understand, but if we were to try to do any sort of comparison or assessment analysis of these programs, I think that would be useful information to know.
We do not have that information.
Further questions? Okay. Thank you very much. Item 4 now comes before us, BET Committee and Special Project Team reports. Also, if there are any other reports not contained in our list, feel free to give you a report. Mr. Norton.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to just make a couple comments in regard to the Audit Committee. At the conclusion of our Audit Committee meeting last Thursday, we met with the auditor, a partner from Bloom Shapiro, to hold an executive session, and the audit process has begun in effect with that meeting, even though they've done some preliminary work. Also, in my report, it indicates how much money the town will be charging off. They all current estimated sum of $38,000 be charged off is all from Nathaniel Withall patient accounts.
Mr. Finger.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment on, or a question on the Nathaniel Witherell Town Building Committee report.
Okay.
It seems to me that since there's still this open issue of the status of the con, and as I understand it, the fair rental value, I think it would be wise for us to consider, or for the building committee to consider, how they spend their money up between now and the time that we know what the final result of the con is. I wouldn't want us to be spending a lot of money to only find out that we're not getting the type of a fair rental value that was anticipated. So that would be the first comment. The second comment is that for this fiscal year 10, we had an appropriation, capital appropriation for Nathaniel Witherell of approximately, I don't remember the exact number, but it was $3 million plus. And I think in June, when we look at capital non-recurring, that we can take a look at that particular appropriation and decide what parts of it should be considered having lapsed.
No, I think, I'm not sure we're going to, unless you're putting that in the form of a motion, I think your points are well taken in terms of having our liaison to the building committee take those comments back. And I would suggest that if you concur with Mr. Finger and his comments, that you simply let Mr. Pellegrino know that, so that in taking that back to the building committee, he has a level of confidence as to that there were, the BET generally felt, or members of the BET, as opposed to just Mr. Finger. I think at this point it's not right maybe for a a sense of the board vote, but that's something that we may want to consider doing depending on where we see the timeline of this in the coming months. And maybe we should revisit that in June as to where we are, and by then we should know a little bit more. Mr. Pellegrino.
Bill, just a comment. One is, first, I think your point is very, very good, and I appreciate it, and I will take it back to the meeting. The specific payments that I do show month in, month out, do know that there's a lag. So many times this is work that has been performed months ago that we're only getting around to approving the invoices now. And the last point, even the discussion item that we brought up of looking for potential help is something that we're very careful about before engaging the additional expense. There really is a thoughtful process of looking at the costs that we're spending. But I appreciate your points.
Further discussion, Ms. Tarkington.
May I ask Mr. Finger a question, then I have another comment? You were referring simply to the capital part of the appropriation and not the soft costs, which is mostly what the building committee has been spending. So I think that's what you meant, right? The amount for capital, the
yeah.
$3 million plus for capital.
That's
not
correct.
the soft costs, which is where it's being spent here.
Correct.
But I also, given this report, would like to just make an additional comment, I think, that the application submitted to the Planning and Zoning Commission is for a project renew that would cost $40,250,000, which is the total appropriation that was brought to the BET Budget Committee last month. However, to date, the Witherall Board has approved only a $36.88 million project, and the CON review by the state, as I understand it, the submission was also for the less costly $36.88 million. So I think that there's a lot of sort of moving things here, and this is good to know. The other comment, last month I asked about making drawings or renderings of Project Renew available to the public, and Witherall did respond by putting what I'd call more of a footprint drawing, a rendering of the buildings, and that's available near the executive director's office within Nathaniel Witherall, but there are no detailed drawings of this project available for the public if they want to see what Witherall will be doing. And at $36.88 million or whatever number, this will be one of the largest projects the town has ever begun or constructed. So I think, putting more information out there about what the project is probably would be constructive at some point in time, particularly since, as you point out in your report, tomorrow night you expect P&Z to issue their preliminary site plan approval, and I would assume also an MI, a municipal improvement approval. Is that correct? Based on, you didn't say that, but I assumed that was also something that would happen.
I can't address municipal improvement, but I do know that the preliminary site plan is scheduled for the vote.
Thank you.
Further discussion, Mr. Simon.
So it seems to me we appropriated $7.3 million 2 years ago for Nathaniel Witherall out of capital, and that would be coming back this June, all $7.3 million, first to the Budget Committee and then to the BET. I think it would only be fair to warn Nathaniel Witherall that we will be looking carefully at this money, all $7.3 million, as to what they've spent, what they've encumbered, where we're going with this. Because the BET does not have, if we don't do anything, this would lapse. Or do we have to force them to return it?
May I just make one comment?
Well, hold on. Let Mr. Marneski, and then I'll recognize.
The $3 million that Mr. Finger referred to as cash that we borrowed in January. The authorization to spend was $7.3 million. There was a $3.6 million piece and a $3.7 million piece. I have been communicating with Robinson and Cole. They're going to take the $3.7 million piece where the money wasn't being spent and take the full $7.3 million and roll it into the $40,250,000, if I have it correct. So there'll be one resolution. the $3 million, the amount that is spent, will have to be paid off through debt service, through the bond fund, ultimately the general fund. The amount that won't be spent will have to go back and be repurposed to other projects. So you're not returning any monies to anywhere. You have to pay off through debt service the piece that's been spent, and then the cash that hasn't been spent has to be repurposed to other projects. Is that clear?
Yeah, but that's not, but the question I asked, let's assume as of today, they said we're not going to do the project. What would happen to the $7.3 million?
The portion that's not spent will lapse.
Most of it,
The portion that's not spent will lapse.
which is how much money? Like 6-point-some million?
Yes, it's, I think they spent between $1 million and $1.5 million.
And we don't have to continue that, do we?
No.
We have
That's
the
that's the question. So at
Yes. But you do, what's important here is that you have to pay back the portion that was spent in the form of debt service. If, say, the project doesn't go forward, then the general fund will have to pay that back through debt service instead of Project Renew over 20 years paying it back. The portion that's not spent, the cash side, will have to be repurposed for other projects. The difference between what you spent and the 7.3 will you'll have to have some type of action for it to go away.
Ms. Tarkington?
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment here. Actually, the BET and the RTM approved a Project Renew through bond resolutions in March and May 2007, respectively. So it's not 2 years, but it was 3 years ago that we made these approvals. That's
We
all.
can still force them to lapse.
Yeah, a question. Is it your recollection that since some of these funds were borrowed, that bond counsel took the position that these were not private activity bonds?
That's correct. Right now, they're not. They don't meet the 5% or 10% rule. Are you we're not talking about the recovery zone bonds. We're talking about the bands, the
Right.
notes that are outstanding.
But those will relate to the intended project, Renew, and the use of that project.
And the question
Is-
about private use?
Yes.
Okay, if it exceeded the 10% rule, then they would become taxable bonds.
Well,
That's the-
there's that issue, but there's the longer issue of whether that's going to be a private activity project.
Oh, that's a different set of questions, and we haven't even got there yet. That the
But
issue
they-
of recovery zone bonds has to be taken care of first, where you've got to issue them before December 31st. Otherwise, we'll be going through with regular general obligation bonds.
I understood there were to be general obligation bonds, but there's a lot of private activity in that facility.
Okay,
You've got private doctors, you've got private,
I understand his question. I can get back to him
Cafeteria stuff?
offline. I'll get a comfort response from Robinson and Cole about the where they analyze the private use portion of the borrowing.
okay.
Well, here's what this, at the very least, what this discussion has shown is that every June, the BET Budget Committee and then the BET, but the discussion primarily happens every June at the Budget Committee level to discuss the lapsing of capital appropriations. Relative to Project Renew, I think there's a heightened awareness as to what will happen with this 7.3 and or other amount that has not been used. And I think what we should do is tee this up not only for a general discussion about capital projects that lapse like we do every year, but I think the Nathaniel Witherell should be asked to attend the Budget Committee meeting, and this should be a separate discussion from that.
It'll have to be separate because there's activity. We only look at the lapsing of projects with no activity for a 12-month period, but
That's fine.
That's definitely, we could put it
So,
on there.
You know, give them advance now that at our June meeting for the Budget Committee, that this will be a discussion point. And I think those who have questions can attend that meeting, and we can figure out where this is headed. Okay? Any other comments or questions regarding the special project team reports? Mr. Norton, I had a question on the audit committee. So I've read the CDL report, and there seem to be issues with a few CDLs. What the report does not discuss is what's the remedy if, in fact, there are issues with reports. So will there be a follow-up report as to how this impacts, say, whether it's operations or how else we conduct business? I know on an ongoing basis this should avoid this problem because we'll do it at the very least on an annual basis. But should we expect a follow-up report to this one?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Actually, when this is complete, meaning when we have driver's license and CDL licenses for all those who have authorization to drive town vehicles, then the Town of Greenwich Vehicle Use Law and the HR Department Policy 414-0 will be amended. Currently, what was discovered with the CDL, there are two individuals with CDL licenses which are under suspension. That has so far been discovered, but we're only at the point of having CDL licenses for Connecticut. We have not yet received them from New York because of the need to have a contract with the state of New York, and it has to be vetted and completed by the law department. And then there was a request that as of today, all town departments present a list with driver's license numbers for those individuals who have authorization to use town vehicles but who just have regular driver's license numbers. So that we have a long way to go on this process, and it probably won't be completed until the fall. But yeah, there will be definitely follow-up on this.
Great, thank you. Further questions or reports? Okay, item 5 now comes before us, the Comptroller's report. Our Comptroller, Peter Mynarski.
Actually, if I could, the bottom of page 3, the last paragraph, just follow up on some of Art's responses to Mr. Walker's questions. Good answer, good question. There was 2 exceptions which probably would result. One is a termination, and one would probably be a termination. Right now there's 8 unresolved cases. What we found is there's discrepancies sometimes between the names or the date of birth, so we're following up with them. As a follow-up, these were all the CDL users, the commercial driver license individuals. We're now going to, as Art said, go for every employee that drives a town vehicle with a regular license. That would be the police department and the fire department. And it would include, for example, myself, if I wanted to use the motor pool, or Roland, or anybody that's going to want to use the motor pool in the future will have to supply a driver's license. And to complete the follow-up to the answer, the special projects coordinator did the bulk of the work here with the assistance of financial analysts in the finance department. Step 1 is to get us in compliance with the federal law and correct, as Art said, amend the human resources manual. Step 2, the finance department will be moving forward. We'll be taking care of this on a yearly basis. But as far as when you hire people, when they walk in the door, it will be the responsibility of the HR department to make sure that a person has a valid driver's license and that the information on it is accurate as far as the name, the date of birth, and it's not a suspended license. So I just wanted to add that piece to you, that the finance department will be taking over the compliance going forward. Does that answer your question fully? This way. Page 1, I'll start out with the RFP for the investment consultant. Just an update and one little piece of information I left out. There was a tentative decision. There was 4 finalists. We had interviews last week. And tentatively, the board wanted to go with the incumbent, New England Pension Consultants. It hasn't been officially, formally voted on. One member of the retirement board did not attend the meetings. And as a courtesy, we would like to include him in the discussions at the May 27th retirement board meeting. The procedure after that will be to go to the BET Investment Committee, present our case, and hopefully the Investment Committee is on board before it goes to the full BET. And the piece that I left out, and sorry, Mr. Campbell and Ms. Barton, the law department will the BET Law Department, the Law Department and the Law Committee will be included because there will be variations of the contract. So I apologize for leaving you out of the process. And then it will go to the full BET. And then there was one more, going back to page 4, I think it was, another follow-up to the Audit Committee. Mr. Norton had asked me for an update on the small claim court, the outstanding delinquencies, and I didn't have much to give him last week because the project had been stalled down. There was a large number of cases, claims that came forward through the windstorm in March and the rainstorm a week later, and we got a little bit behind. What we did is I met today with Abby Wadler, the Law Department, Greg Hannigan, and we are sending out of a sample or a selection of 17 delinquencies of over $500, we're sending 5 with applications to the courts. There's $75 per application, and the person or either the individual homeowner or the business has 30 days to contest it. I paid. I want to pay, whatever the reason is. If they fail to contest it properly, it gets into the court system, and we are looking at, the process is 2 to 3 months, is to get on the docket for September. We just, Mr. Fox wanted to go with 5 initially, then after that we'll expand the number that go to the courts.
Can you run through those numbers again? There are 17 with owing of greater than 500?
Okay, let me just back up a little bit. The number changes every month because there's all new delinquencies coming every month and people are paying. The selection that was picked about 2 months ago was a number of 17 that were over 500 that we wanted to send to the courts for small claim court. We decided, I should say, the town attorney decided to narrow it down on a test case basis, initially send 5 to the courts out of the 17. And once we go through the process, send out the file with the court, send out the notifications, and understand the process, get it on the docket, and appear in court, we'll figure out if there's anything that needs to be corrected. Then we'll expand the process, and the number will change. So the 17 was the selection that was picked a couple months ago, but that number changes every month.
Mr. Chairman?
And these are just police or fire?
These are just police. I haven't seen a fire delinquency show up yet in this election. Mr.
Norton.
The 5 that are chosen, do any of them include the marina user fees delinquencies?
No. They're queued up right behind this. We're waiting for this process to see how this works. And
Okay, I thought our intent was to combine both when we went to
that is the intent, but right now we're limited to only 5 from the original selection.
And they're all from the false alarms?
Yes. Police false alarms. Any other questions on that?
Simon.
I mean, to me, it makes no sense to take someone to court when they may owe you additional money for fire alarms without combining both of these together.
No, I agree. The answer to the question was there was none.
There was what?
There was no fire delinquencies that fit this category.
No, I think Mr. Simon's point is if citizen Y owes $500 for false alarms to the police department and owes another $500 as a result of fire alarm, false alarms, then doesn't it make more sense to bring one claim for $1,000 to small claims under the two penalties?
No, it makes perfect sense, but we intended to do that if such a situation occurred. If somebody owed $1,000, $500 for police and $500 for fire, we would be collecting $1,000 with one application.
But are you saying that as of this group of 5 that this group of 5 only owes under police?
In this election. That's not to say that there's people out there that have both violations. They're just not in this selection. If they did get into a future selection, we would go for the total delinquency. Under 5,000, because we can't.
Under 5. I'll just ask the question. Do these 5 people have any fire department false alarms?
No.
Okay.
Mr. Campbell and then Mr. Huffman.
Just because you keep using the phrase "a selection of 17," I'm not sure I understand what that means. That is, are there, at the time that selection was made, there were more than 17 who owed at least $500, and you were just choosing 5 of a group? I'm confused.
When we 2 or 3 months ago, when we sat down in the law department to select a group to send to the courts, there was 17 of them. Okay.
And if I could, so 17 was the total number?
Yeah.
Okay.
1 or 2 or 3, without naming names, paid, and we decided to go with a group of 5 selected by the law department.
Mr. Huffman.
Just to clarify in my mind, isn't it your experience that the fire false alarms are very, very much fewer than any of the
Yes.
police alarms?
Yes.
So you really are not having much incidence of it at all?
Hardly any at all.
Yeah.
Any questions on other parts of the controller's report?
I just have don't need to answer it tonight, but I see under your cash management section that we received the education cost-sharing money in April. And I was just wondering if for the budget packet in June, if you could also provide an update as to all of the reimbursement, whether it Hamilton Avenue or Glenville or any of the, any monies that we were thinking that we were going to receive, whether it was in fiscal year 10 or then in fiscal year 11. What's the status of that? And if you know, obviously I know sometimes you don't know where it is in the pipeline, but it would be helpful to have that information.
School construction reimbursements?
Just any reimbursement that we thought that we were either going to receive in 2010 or the beginning part of 2011 fiscal year.
Okay.
All right. No, that's education cost sharing. But it jogged my memory of that we're still waiting, I believe, for some of that money. I just want to see where we are in the process.
Mr. Chairman?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
I'm just trying to keep track of it so that everybody's on the same page as to where that money is.
Yeah.
Mr. Norton.
Peter, didn't you advise me the other day that we have not received any of the school reimbursement money yet?
As a matter of fact, we received 1.5 and change today.
Oh, okay.
I didn't know that, but
As of Thursday, we had
I didn't want to
nothing.
bring it up, but we had difficulty because the state sends it to a third-party account called Reich and Tang, and they only send it with a dollar amount, and it was $1.5 million and change, and we couldn't figure out how much of it was Glenville School and how much of it was Hamilton Avenue. So to answer your question, we got between $1.5 million and $1.6 million today.
Oh, good. So that was the money we were waiting. That was part of the.
Exactly, it was.
All right.
Report, though.
No, this is a timing difference. This is, Kathleen had forecasted that the ECS money would come in 1 month. It came April 30th, and it was a favorable variance in the April report. That's what she's doing, is reconciling her cash forecast from month to month, why it didn't meet the previous forecast because of positive and negative variances.
Mr. Walker, one other thing that you should know.
Mr.
That
Kelly?
was Mr. Norton who brought the superintendent into the audit committee for that money, for that Hamilton Avenue in Glenville, because they had not done what they needed to do. That was a few months ago, as I recall. Yeah, okay.
further questions? Is there a motion to accept the comptroller's report? Moved by Mr. Norton. Second by Mr. Raymer. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention, 12-0-0. Item 6 now comes before us. Treasurer's report. Are there any questions? Moved by Mr. Norton. Second by Mr. Mason. Discussion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention, 12-0-0. Approval of BET meeting minutes for April 19th, 2010. Is there a motion? Moved by Mr. Raymer, second by Mr. Simon. Discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention, 12-0-0. Officers' report. Item 8 now is before us. First, let me just thank everyone again for their work on the budget. I thought that the meetings, and I include the committee meetings and then the district meetings, were excellent examples of having citizen input in our process. Certainly, I'm sure as a BET, we learned a lot in going to the various standing committees and then the district meetings. One of these days, we're actually going to get the resolutions perfect, or not. And I think the votes were an acknowledgement of the work that was done all leading up to the RTM meeting. And certainly, I know, speaking just for myself, I don't take that vote for granted. And I think it's a testament to all the work that's done both behind this dais and then also out there. Certainly, the RTM Budget Committee's Finance Committee and BOC committees are looking towards bigger, longer-term projects. And so my understanding is there's even been some email traffic asking for Finance Department help in that regard. And so we welcome that and hopefully can work together in coming up with some other ways to make our government even more responsive and efficient. Tonight, obviously, as we get to the end of this meeting, we'll be approving a mill rate, and that'll close the chapter, at least on the approval process of the budget, and then we can move on from there. As I like to say, we start almost immediately with the guidelines for next year's budget. In the meantime, we have things like Project Renew and shared services to deal with. So we'll be tackling those over the next few months. We already discussed the assessor going to Round Hill, and so I think it's a positive step that we'll reach out now to the other neighborhood associations to do that. I've also been invited. I haven't selected a date yet, but I've been invited to the Retired Men's Association to give a presentation on the budget and where we are. So I'm looking forward to that in the coming weeks and or months. It's also nice that former members of this board have been recognized. Peter Crumbine was recognized by the Greenwich Bar Association at its Law Day luncheon for his contribution. And so anytime I hear about the good works of those who have served on this board, we try to make mention of that. And that's all I have for my report. Clerk or the Vice Chairman? Anything else? No?
Yeah.
Okay. Old business now comes before us. With that, our clerk and chairman of the OPEB Ad Hoc Committee,
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Pellegrino.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to move the resolution before us, which is to adopt the new investment policy statement, and that this investment policy statement substitutes for existing documentation.
It's been moved by Mr. Pellegrino, second by Mr. Simon.
Mr. Chairman, if I may make a few points.
Please.
Briefly. As it pertains to this investment policy statement, the OPEB board will make investment recommendations, and they will make them to the Investment Advisory Committee of the BET. Specifically, those recommendations will be to asset allocation and investment vehicles. The Investment Advisory Committee will be hereby empowered to either accept or reject the board's recommendations, provided they are within the specified ranges as spelled out in this investment policy statement. In terms of the vehicles, it's recommended that mutual funds or exchange-traded funds be used, whether they're passive or active, but specifically individual securities may not be recommended. The board, the trust board, OPEB trust board, shall now meet at least quarterly. And those meetings, in terms of rebalancing and asset allocation recommendations, shall be for the months of August, November, February, and May. Finally, the OPEB board shall report to the Investment Advisory Committee annually and present to them their outlook and expectations for asset class performance and the reasoning behind the investments and allocations that they recommend. If I may add some additional thoughts. With the adoption of this resolution and investment policy statement, we will now have one document that addresses the role of the OPEB board and the mechanism by which the trust board shall be, by which the board shall be governed and managed. We'll also put in place guidelines for asset classes, suitable investment vehicles, and a mechanism for rebalancing appropriate at this level. And finally, we will have replaced any hard and fast mechanical rebalancing program with the judgment of 3 professionals, along with the reflection of 4 members of the BET before any rebalancing takes place. In conclusion, we have one last ad hoc committee meeting scheduled for June 21st, and then we will have completed the assignment that, Mr. Chairman, you presented to the ad hoc committee.
Thank you. Further discussion. This topic generated a quite deal of comment last meeting. We sent it back, and I think now what you see is the revision, so that I think it's more, it's certainly clearer in its presentation and in its document. I think that's a step in the right direction. I should also note that the goal here obviously is to move towards an OPEB trust board that can operate on its own in terms of giving that advice to the BET. And with that, we would expect the Investment Advisory Committee to vet candidates to replace Mr. Pellegrino on that board, so that we have 3 citizens to operate that board. And then it's our job also then to select its chairman. So I've asked Mr. Norton through the Finance Department to transmit what is, at least I know of, one candidate, if not any others that they may be looking at. And certainly if you have comments, you should make those through either the Finance Department or directly to Mr. Norton as its chair, and with the hopes of then being able to select a chairman as well. And that'll be coming probably in June or July. Mr. Finger.
For those watching on Channel 79, we are still open to receiving applications or resumes of people who would be interested in serving. So people should not feel as though we have already selected the last candidate.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Norton.
To follow up with what Mr. Finger just reported, the next meeting of the Investment Advisory Committee is scheduled for June 3rd, Thursday morning. It'll be either at 8 or 8:30, and I believe it's scheduled for the Gisborne Room. And at this point, we have one additional nominee for the OPEB Trust Board, and we are looking for any additional. At that meeting, we will interview all the candidates that have come before us until that time, and make recommendations to the full board for who that filling that 3rd vacancy effective July 1st, as well as recommending to the full board a chair of the OPEB ad hoc, the OPEB Trust Board.
Fair enough. Okay. Further discussion on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention, 12-0-0. Item 10 now comes before us. We have 2 items under new business. The first is the tax collector regarding sewer assessment delinquencies. This is a matter that's been referred to us through the Budget Committee. So, Mr. Mason, why don't you at least present it for its first reading?
Our new tax collector came and brought this before us, Mr. Chairman, and it relates to Section 260 of the Town Charter for the sewer assessments, and this hadn't come to us before. So what our suggestion was to put it up before the board for a first read, to let everybody have an attempt at looking through it, and on behalf of the Budget Committee to ask you if you would refer it to the Law Committee for a look over by that committee and bring it back to us next month for a final read and approval.
I think the plan is for it to go back to the Law Committee. Certainly, I think I've already heard some comments about trying to wordsmith this, so I think it's more appropriate, or it is appropriate to have this flow through one of our committees for that type of action. But I would also ask that if you have, this is also a policy question in terms of whether or not we wish to go down this path and write this letter, so or send it out. So I would ask that if you do have concerns about this or questions or just wanting to know its origination, that we do try to flow through the finance department just so that our tax collector isn't inundated with 12 separate calls from various BET members, or contact the law committee that seems to be taking the lead on this, or has been given the lead on this, whether they like it or not, and they can then communicate with the tax collector, and at least from that perspective, we have some sort of mechanism to funnel our questions. So far, at least in talking with several of you, I haven't heard any real objection to having this letter go out, but certainly if you do have that, I'd rather have that discussion as we begin to prepare it, as opposed to at the final product night come next month, and that way we can move this forward. But my understanding is so far it's received sort of the general thumbs up, and now we just need to make sure it works. Mr. Simon?
So is the intent to send this to only people that are delinquent, or to every person who has a sewer construction assessment?
This will go, right now, there's only eight properties that fit this.
So this
That-
would only be delinquent people?
Yes. And let me make this clear. None of these are in the North Miami Sewer Project. Legally, because of the lawsuit, we can't even go there. These are 8 from the other sewer assessed projects. And they have to be delinquent for 2 successive years. And what this does is it makes, let's say that they didn't pay the first 2 years, it makes all 20 payments delinquent. It accelerates the process.
So do we have a fixed rate of interest?
It's each borrowing has a fixed rate of interest. For example, Millbrook in North Miami, it was 4.181.
No, but when it says due and payable with interest, we're not putting an interest penalty on this?
Well, it also gets the interest for the delinquency. There's the bond interest and there's delinquency for being late. I think these are perfect questions that need to be compiled and put together so that we could have the tax collector will be here in the July or June meeting to answer all these questions.
And what happens if the taxpayer ignores the letter?
We can foreclose.
All right, so that would go in the letter too. I mean, something has to be here saying what the interest rate, what the consequences are, as opposed to turning off their sewer
Or if you
connection.
choose
That
not
would
to
be worse.
foreclose, it's they're all 20 payments are delinquent.
The goal here, just to correct the comptroller to some degree here, the goal here would be that discussion not necessarily happen here, but at the law committee meeting.
Correct.
Where there's just a better way, it's just a better forum by which to handle these types of questions. But if you have them in advance, then the law committee can get them answered. My understanding is that some work has already been done to answer several of these types of questions, and maybe we just need to have the tax collector put it down in writing so that we can distribute it out. Mr. Campbell.
Just to ask one more question in that vein, I take it that these homeowners, when they originally received their assessment, and of course they had the option to pay the full amount at that time, or to elect to pay over 20 years, they obviously elected to pay over 20 years, and I would presume that there is some sort of written policy that they were given at that time stating that if they were delinquent, that this could be the result, that they would owe the full balance.
I'm not sure. I don't want to answer that because I don't know, but I would guess that they were not notified that this statute, Section 260, would apply. I'm guessing. But I don't think that they knew the consequences, that they would have to pay all 20 if they missed the first 2 payments.
Or if they missed any 2 payments.
Right. So I think these are the types of, this is why this letter on its face looks fairly benign, but when you dig a little deeper,
Yep.
there are some real policy concerns here, and I think that's why it came for a first read. I think it's appropriate for that, and we'll try to work it and have a discussion with the tax collector between now and our next meeting. Okay? The last item under new business comes before us, approval of the 2010-2011 mill rate. For that, I will call on our clerk, Mr. Pellegrino.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move the first resolution, which is for the general fund, and this is resolved that a tax at the rate of 8.596 mils be applied for fiscal year 2010-2011. That is a increase of 3.37% over fiscal year 2009, 2010.
It's been, and it is as you should have received in your packet. Moved by Mr. Pellegrino for a general fund mill rate of 8.596.
Second.
Second by Mr. Simon. Discussion.
I have one comment.
Mr.
So
Simon?
don't we have to first vote on a dollar amount for the senior tax relief? Somewhere in this process, we have to actually vote on setting that number. It's part of what the ordinance is, that the BET approves the senior tax relief. And I think we should do that personally before we vote on the mill rate, because the mill rate's essentially predicated upon a number being voted on.
Isn't that part of the budget?
Well, it's part of the budget, though.
Yeah.
And so it's not really predicated if, I mean, it is if you drill down, if there was a large variance.
I think within, even if we pass these three items, I think we have to take a separate vote on this number. You can render an opinion.
I'm not sure I agree, but
I think you get to reset it if from the time you do the budget.
You think?
And we come to this point, and there's a big difference between, like Steve said, what the actual results turned out to be, then you can look at it again.
You don't think it says the BET approves the amount for the senior, for the elderly tax? We have Mr. Dibler over there, who's a well-known expert on this topic. But I thought we actually had to explicitly.
We put it in the budget, right? It was in it's in the budget number, and last year we had this big debate because we had an open number.
It wasn't in the budget that was approved by the RTM. It was only in the budget schedules that we used, which is why I think, I mean, I do think when we pass the ordinance, and that clause, this is the point I raised earlier, with whether or not it says the BT will approve the amount.
I'm inclined to vote for the number because I don't think there's a really, there's a harm in that. But I think from, this is now year 2 or 3 that we're.
Last year, we approved a specific number.
We did approve it last year, but last year there was an issue pertaining to that particular fund. This year, in the budget, we said we were going to fully fund it. We have fully funded it, and now in fact, we over budgeted for it.
We over budgeted, but remember the RTM never approves the appropriation. This is not something the RTM approves. It's something the RTM delegated to us to approve. There was a lot of discussion on this. So I personally think we should vote for approving the 904.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Norton.
to accomplish what Mr. Simon is recommending, we're going to have to table the item that's on the table.
Well, we can take it up after this item.
Yeah, well, let's table it, Larry, and then take up your item.
It's not on the agenda.
Well, we could take that up too. Okay, so
I'll move to table the motion as presented in the mill rating for fiscal 2011.
the Pellegrino-Simon, Mr. Norton has moved to table the Pellegrino-Simon motion relative to the mill rate. Is there a second to that?
I'll second it.
Second by Mr. Kelly. Discussion on tabling. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 12-0-0. Now, Mr. Simon has moved to approve
$904,000 for the senior tax relief program.
Can I ask a question?
Mr. Kelly. Well, let's somebody second that. and
I'll
then
second it.
Second by Mr. Kelly.
Larry, Mr. Simon, correct me if I'm wrong. This is what the RTM left this open at their budget meeting and left us to fill in the blank?
Yeah, the RTM, I believe, and we have, someone has a copy of the ordinance over there, that it says the BET every year will approve an amount for this as part of the budget process.
Oh, all right. Okay, so then we need to fill in the blank for this, and I don't see any harm in doing it. We're all agreed on what the number should be approximately, so let's.
So that's why I asked him if the 904 was enough. He said he rounded up, so he thought it was enough, and I think we should approve the $904,000 as the amount for the senior tax relief.
All right, so then, yeah, we're covered on what we have to do. So I'll.
Discussion, Mr. Raymer, and then Mr. Huff.
Just to respect the tax assessor's suggestion that has a few $100s of swing, wouldn't it be smart for us to approve slightly more than the 904? Second thought was, is there a concern here that the setting of a figure for the senior tax relief wasn't on the agenda? Is that a problem for us?
It is. Ms. Barton?
I wouldn't think so. I think it falls under mill rate calculation. That's where it is on the budget schedule that we're referring to, and it is part of setting the mill rate.
I agree.
I would support that interpretation, Mr. Chairman.
You know,
I would too.
I jinxed us. I normally don't do this, but in today's meeting, I pulled off my shelf both my Robert's Rules and my charter, and I should never have done that.
The charter's here. I have the charter.
So, Ms. Barton, I'll take the esteemed viewpoint of our law committee on this one.
Both members.
Yes, and so based on that, we'll take it up. Mr. Huffman.
Well, isn't this just an approval or an appropriation in accordance with the provisions of the senior tax credit program, and then establish that become a part of the mill rate calculation?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a perfect world going forward, and we should revisit this, but if, Mr. Simon might be correct on this, it should be a separate, it should come before the mill rate calculation every year. It should have its own line item to it. It should make people focus on it, and it should follow suit. So we'll just need to correct that in years going forward. Mr. Raymer?
I wonder if I then might move an amendment to Mr. Simon's motion for the figure to be 905 instead of 904. If somebody on the panel thinks that it's still a larger number is appropriate, that's all right with me too.
Mr. Simon and Mr. Kelly, do you agree?
Yes.
Okay, so the motion by Mr. Simon and by Mr. Kelly is 905.
Mr. Mason has a concerned look on his face.
Further discussion. That's why I'm looking this way. Okay. Mr. Mason?
Nope.
Okay. See, it worked.
It's a short discussion.
Further discussion. All those in favor of the Simon Kelly motion for the senior tax relief at 905,000 signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstained. 12-0-0. Okay.
Now I move to remove it off the table, the item.
Now the column doesn't add correctly.
Column doesn't have that. This column is not part of anything.
Are we talking about the column of the worksheet?
Yes.
That's correct. Okay. So, Mr. Norton?
I'm talking about the column in the budget schedule where we've just changed $1,050,000 to $905,000. And there is a total underneath there that is now wrong. And then you have to divide that by
What
the
sheet?
grand list to come up with a mill rate.
Believe me, by the end of the day, it'll be perfect.
Yeah.
All right, hold on. Mr. Norton, do you have a motion?
Yes, to take off the table with the motion to consider the first item for the mill rate.
Moved by Mr. Norton.
Second.
Second by Mr. Campbell. Thank you. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? 12-0-0. So now we are back to the motion by Mr. Pellegrino, second by Mr. Simon, as it appears in your packet for a 8.596 mill rate for the general fund tax on the assessment list of October 1st, 2009 for fiscal year 2010-2011. Discussion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention? 12-0-0.
Okay.
Mr.
Mr.
Pellegrino?
Chairman?
Yes.
I'd like to now move the resolution for the sewer maintenance fund, and this is resolved that a tax at the rate of 0.38 mils be applied for the fiscal year 2010-2011.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino.
Second.
Second by Mr. Mason. Discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? 12-0-0.
And now, Mr. Chairman, the last resolution is for the sewer improvement fund. This is resolved at a tax rate of 0.073 mils for fiscal year 2010, 2011.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino. Second by Mr. Norton. Discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Very good. Once again, congratulations. Thank you to the Finance Department for all their help. Any further business to come before us this evening? So moved.
Second.
Thank you.